So is A Lange Sohne actually as good as Patek Philippe? Hi everyone and welcome to Shah Lusso. And yes, today we're going to be talking about whether A Lange Sohne is as good as Patek Philippe. Now before I get started, I want to give a big thanks to Watches Market Dubai for lending in the A Lange Sohne langematik that I'm going to be featuring throughout this video. Make sure to check their links in the description below. And also before I get started, I want to mention this isn't going to be a versus episode. So I'm not actually going to be judging on which one is best. It's more about seeing whether A Lange Sohne really deserves to be in the same conversation as a powerhouse like Patek Philippe. So to do that, I'm going to be looking at 4 criteria that I think make Patek Philippe such a renowned brand, and that is their history, innovation, decoration and movements, and their brand identity. So let's get right into it, and we have to start with history. Well, with history in most luxury watch brands, it's a bit of an imprecise issue, for lack of a better way to put it, because there's so many key dates and watch brands tend to pick the oldest, most thin excuse so they can add a few more years to their longevity. But Patek Philippe is one of those brands where no matter which point you pick, it's still quite old. For reference, in 1839, it was originally founded as Patek and Zapek. However, in 1851, Zapek left the partnership and was replaced by Philippe, hence the Patek Philippe that we know today. Then in 1932, they were purchased by the Stern family, which still controls it till this day, with Thierry Stern being at the head of the company right now. So whichever way you cut it, this is a brand that's been in continuous production and activity for well over 150 years. Then you have A Lange Sohne, where things are a little bit more complex. In 1845, it was founded as A Lange Sohne by Ferdinand Lange. And then it lasted right until 1948, at which point it was nationalized as part of East Germany. And it largely lay dormant for the entire time right up until 1990, when it was refounded by Walter Lange, a descendant of the original founder, and Gunther Blumlein. From then, they were acquired in 2000 by the Richemont Group, so they did have a sizable gap in their production. Now, me personally, the way I look at that, I look at A Lange Sohne as being a company founded in 1990. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing. I'll explain why in the next section. However, this does mean that at least on a history standpoint, in my opinion, it doesn't quite stack up to Patek Philippe. Moving on to innovations. Well, Patek Philippe being around for the better part of 150 years, obviously they've been around for the time of lots of discoveries and made many of those discoveries and innovations on their own. Things like the invention of the perpetual calendar, which they did back in 1889. In 1902, they invented the split-second chronograph. Fast forward till the 90s, in 1996 they released the annual calendar, well over 100 years later from when they invented the perpetual calendar. I'm not quite sure why it took them so long to do it, but they still invented both. Throughout most of the 21st century though, they've mostly been focusing not so much on innovations in the sense of inventing new complications, more on figuring out how to make existing ones work better. They've done a lot of experimentation with silicone and silicone-based materials for their escapements and for their hairsprings, in order to improve the accuracy and longevity of their movements. A similar sort of approach can be demonstrated with their 2017 advanced research model, which again didn't introduce a new complication, instead a new way to interact with the complication through what they call their compliant mechanism, which from a practical sense reduces the amount of parts needed to operate the Aquanaut's travel time function. Meanwhile, Lange, as I mentioned, was refounded in 1990, but they've been very, very busy in that time, and this is why I don't think it's such a bad thing that they can be counted as a company founded in the 90s, because they've done so much with the time since then. Starting with 1997, and as featured on this langematik, we have the zero reset function, which takes hacking seconds one step further. Not only does it hack the balance when you're setting it, but it automatically resets it to 0. So it makes it much easier to set the time precisely versus having to wait for it to reach 0, then hack, then sync it with a reference time. But it doesn't stop there. In 2004, they invented the double split chronograph, which allows you not only to split your seconds, but also to split your minutes and your seconds. Over 10 years later, they followed that up again with the triple split chronograph, which, as you can guess, allows you to measure not only 2 sets of minutes and seconds, but 2 sets of minutes, seconds, and hours. So it's quite literally 2 different chronographs with 3 different measurements, all in one watch. And then last but not least, rewind back to 2009 when they introduced the Zeitwerk. In my view, one of the most interesting complications and approaches to watchmaking in the 21st century. They managed to create a mechanical watch that showed the time digitally. And the Herculean task they would have had in developing that, because they need to apply a large amount of force every 60 seconds plus every 60 minutes for when they change the hour. They have to shift these discs around with enough force, but also make sure that they stop in time, all without damaging the mechanism, and also making sure that it doesn't run out of power quickly. It still features a 38-hour power reserve despite the massive amount of torque that has to go through it in order to change the time. So without a doubt, in my opinion, the amount of innovations they've done in their short lifespan more than outweighs the fact that Patek is well over a century older than it if you count Lange as only starting in 1990. However, there are a few other callbacks to their pre-war history that I'll address in a minute. So let's go right into it, and that is the decoration. Now, Patek Philippe, they have the Patek Philippe seal. Think what you will about them self-certifying, but without a doubt, the standards are extremely high, not only in precision, which is +3 - 2 seconds, which is very close to Rolex's superlative chronometer certification, but also when you look at the finishing. There's so much hand finishing going on, so many differential finishes. There's black polished surfaces, they have the gold rotors. Without a doubt, they're extremely well decorated movements. But Lange takes things to another level, and also their consistency in doing so, and their transparency in what makes a Lange movement. You can go on their website and see what precise things they're doing on every single movement to make sure that it meets their standards. You have the use of what's known as German silver, which is actually nickel, copper, and zinc. It gives off a much warmer tone than what you see in most rhodium-plated brass movements from Swiss manufacturers. And that's always covered in what's known as glacute stripes, which are very similar to Côte de Genève or Geneva stripes. But also there's the fact that most of their watches will feature a 3/4 plate. This is something inspired from their pocket watch era pre-war, which they've carried over as a design cue that they still honor and pay homage to today. And while that may hide most of the mechanism, it does also provide extra structural integrity. And throughout it, they'll feature blued screws, which have to be done in an oven, and no pun intended, if they overcook it, they have to start all over again. And then when you talk about the parts that you see on every Lange, well, when you look at their escapement, specifically their balance bridge or balance cocks, they have them all completely hand engraved. And this is something that's emblematic of a Lange, and they do it on every single model, even their new Odysseus. They had the opportunity to cut costs and half-ass it, but instead they've done it to the exact same standard, and that shows real integrity. They had an opportunity to downgrade their quality, but they didn't, out of sheer integrity. And that's one of the things that makes Lange a bit odd, because they're owned by a big conglomerate, Richemont, but they still take decisions like an independent. So I think there's a lot of that going into building a brand. And that takes us right into the final category, which is brand identity. When you think of Patek Philippe, right away you can have an image in your head. Most likely it's something either from the Nautilus Aquanaut family with the Genta design and aesthetic, or it's something that's derivative of the Calatrava. Of course they have other models, the Gondolo, the Golden Ellipse, but for the most part there are 2 distinct aesthetics that you can think of right away when you think Patek Philippe. They're never particularly busy, they're usually quite thin, you won't really come across a thick Patek Philippe, even their chronographs aren't particularly thick, and they'll always have a very sophisticated air towards them. And of course the standards of finish don't just finish at their movements, they're extended to the case as well. With Lange, it's again something where they've put a lot of effort to develop a brand identity. So much of it is in those movements, and it shows where their focus is. Their focus number 1, first, second, and third is on the movements, and that's why so much of their brand identity is ingrained in that. When you see a Lange movement, you don't need to see the word Lange on it to know where it came from. And that's because they put so much focus on consistency in their design from the back. From the front, however, you can still tell it's a Lange. Their case shapes are largely a little bit more chunky than something like a Patek Philippe, but not by any means are they overbearing or oversized. And they'll often feature a big date. They may not have invented the big date, but they've definitely absorbed it as part of their brand identity. So much so when they made a day-date complication in the Odysseus, they used the same format to create their day-date complication. So this shows a certain dedication to consistency and establishing a brand identity, because they haven't had 150 years to establish that. They had a head start, but then they had to stop for half a century, so they've definitely been using the most with their time. So if we add all this up, in my view at least, Lange is definitely more than deserving of being in the same conversation as Patek Philippe. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think? What are your favorite models from both of these brands, and do you think that they are on equal footing, or is one better than the other? I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments below. And of course, a big thanks to Watches Market Dubai for lending in the A Lange Sohne langematik featured throughout this video to illustrate some of these points. And also, if you like this video, please do like it and share it. It really helps the channel when you share these videos because it allows me to reach a much broader audience. So I really appreciate that. And if you want to keep seeing new videos, make sure you subscribe to the channel as well and hit the notification bell so that you can know when the next video comes up. And last but not least, if you want to see pictures of this langematik as well as several others and my infographics, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shah Lusso. But thank you for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.